You're listening to the Cinemental podcast.
Shall we begin?
Okay, welcome back to the Cinemental podcast, where we discuss mental health in cinema and television and how it is portrayed. What did they get right? What did they get wrong? And what should you know about mental health? I'm Jeffrey Jones, and I'm a screenwriter as well as a professor of screenwriting, and I'm joined, as always, by my brother, a general and forensic psychiatrist, Dr. Joshua Jones. We want you to start your week
Wonderful
off right.
day to you.
There you go. Sorry, I forgot to let you say your piece.
Yep, yeah, just fine.
In fact, you know what? Let's just do that part again. I'll edit it. I'm Jeffrey Jones, and I'm a screenwriter as well as a professor of screenwriting, and I'm joined by my brother, a general and forensic psychiatrist, Dr. Josh Jones. We want you to start your week off right with our podcast, so we drop a new episode every Monday morning at 9 a.m. Eastern. You can listen to us wherever you get your podcasts, or you can watch us on YouTube or Patreon. Please know that all the proceeds from Patreon are donated to 988 call centers. Hey, Josh, speaking of 988 call centers.
Well, Jeff, 988 is the National Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. It's a number that you or someone you know can call or text if you're suicidal or in a mental health crisis. And quick disclaimer about this podcast, the information expressed here is for educational and informational purposes only. Nothing expressed in this podcast is medical advice, and no doctor-patient relationship is created. And of course, folks, spoilers galore in this podcast.
Yes, this is the quickest we've done. Civil War, as of this recording, is still in theaters. We haven't done one this quickly before since its release. Normally we do stuff that's been in the zeitgeist for a while. So massive spoilers, but this is a fun one. We're excited to talk about this one.
Big spoiler, this movie is about a civil war.
This is. Okay, so thank you for that, Josh. Today we are talking about Civil War, a movie about a not too distant future where a dictator has taken control of the nation, and states like California, Texas, and Florida have somehow banded together and seceded from the Union and are determined to overthrow the government. And the story follows four journalists, as they make their way to D.C. to try and interview the president. This is not a documentary of the 1999 Jones Family Holiday Game Tournament that Josh ruined by cheating at Scrabble, as the title Civil War may suggest. Josh, tell our audience about what we're covering today.
Well, first of all, Jeff, you can fuck right off with all that. So folks, we're about 10 episodes in, and Jeff is just bringing out all the Jones Family hits, which I assume he will just do more and more often.
Probably.
So but what we're gonna talk about today, we're gonna talk about war. And war's effect on the human psyche, specifically trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder. And then we're also going to delve into how war is the psychopath's refuge, which I think is a fascinating topic. And this movie does a great job of exposing some of it.
Great.
So, Jeff?
Love it. Yeah, but as always, before we get started, I want to briefly mention this week's sponsor. This week is an exciting one. We have a pretty big sponsor for the first time. We're starting to hit the big time clearly here at Cinemental. This week's sponsor is Hasbro. The makers of Scrabble, and they're coming out with a new edition of Scrabble called the Josh Jones edition. It's the same Scrabble you know and love, but with 3 rule changes. 1, be nice. 2, don't be a cheater. And 3, try not to ruin Christmas. So that's this week's sponsor.
I actually don't know what Jeff's talking about. I was not the big cheat in our family. The big cheat in our family around Christmas games was our mom.
That's actually true.
She was just the worst cheater. And Parcheesi, I don't know where the Scrabble came from. Parcheesi was the game that almost wrecked our family, because she would sit on that Parcheesi blockade.
Yeah.
For freaking ever.
True.
Forever.
My favorite was in categories where we would tell her that something didn't count. And then she would just count it anyway, because she's like, you guys are wrong. It should totally count. And then we would have to rescore her game at the end to see what her real score was.
Or she'd write down 3 or 4 words, and we'd say, no, that one doesn't count. Okay, well, then this is my word. I was like, you can't just... Yeah, she was the biggest cheat. So thank you for throwing me under the bus. I disagree. Why don't we get into the movie?
Yeah, you're still alive, so it's no fun to throw mom under the bus. Okay, so the movie starts with a bang, quite literally. Kirsten Dunst and Wagner Mora taking pictures of a riot, and we're introduced to the young upstart photojournalist played by Kaylee Spaney. And Kirsten saves Kaylee's life when she spots a suicide bomber, and they hide behind a police car. It's an incredible opening scene. And before we dive too much into it, Josh, those are the three main characters. Give us your diagnosis of those characters.
Yeah, so Civil War is all about trauma. It's all about trauma. So let's just focus on Lee, because I think that they showed most of the symptomatology in Kirsten Dunst's character. And she just does such a phenomenally good job with this role. So Lee clearly has post-traumatic stress disorder. She's got most of the hallmark symptoms of it. She has been exposed to threatened death and serious injury numerous times as a war correspondent. She's witnessed numerous traumatic events. She has recurrent, involuntary, and intrusive, distressing memories of those traumatic events. I think we see that early on when she's in
pretty
the
quickly.
bathtub
Yeah,
in
pretty
the
quickly
hotel.
she's replaying the events of. Yeah.
Yeah. Of clearly foreign wars that she covered previous to this American Civil War. She has dissociative reactions, flashbacks to events. She has numbing and avoidance of memories, thoughts, and feelings of the events. She's put on this cloak of numbness around her, and that comes out in feelings of detachment and estrangement from others, a persistent negative emotional state, and some persistent and negative exaggerated beliefs about the world. Interesting. One criteria I didn't get that's actually very important when you're making the diagnosis of PTSD is I didn't get the absolute sense for marked alterations in arousal or reactivity. They didn't really show her being irritable or hypervigilant or having a startle response.
So that was all of that was great. I think that there were too many big words in there. Slow it down for me and talk about what marked alterations in arousal, like dumb that one down for me.
Sorry. Really good point. Thanks for keeping me grounded here, Jeff. So this means when you're on edge and your sympathetic nervous system, your fight, flight, freeze response is amped up to 11. And that's how I tend to describe this when I'm talking to people and giving them the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. That's more how I talk to people, is that your anxiety, your reactivity mechanism has been cranked up to 11. So let me just, before we get back to the movie, let's talk about PTSD for a bit, because it's a pretty common diagnosis. It's a common diagnosis in psychiatry. And I think it's really unfortunate what we've decided to name it. So we call it post-traumatic stress disorder. Okay. And we've talked on this podcast how a disorder is when a syndrome affects your functioning. Right. What I don't like about it here is I don't like the connotation that suggests to people that there's something wrong with them, because I think the arousal mechanisms in our brain
fight or flight,
functioning as fight, flight, or freeze.
Okay,
are functioning
fight, flight, or freeze.
As designed. These arousal mechanisms to really hammer home this memory of this is a bad thing that happened to you. You want to avoid this at all costs. Probably evolved with this very early. This was probably the thing that allowed us to remember, hey, that cave over there has the pack of saber-toothed tigers in it that killed all my family. Right. And it just hammers it home. And I think that this has stayed with us. And some people have described PTSD as a reasonable reaction to very unreasonable events.
Okay.
I think a lot of people end up feeling guilty that they've done something wrong when they experience PTSD, when it's really a reaction about something that's happened to them.
I love that. I love that distinction. And if you didn't call it PTSD, what would the D be? Because this does. Go ahead.
I would call it post-traumatic. I just call it post-traumatic stress.
Okay,
post-traumatic stress symptoms.
But this is different than normal stress in that, like, this is oftentimes triggered, and this can get in the way of normal functioning. PTSD often gets in the way of normal functioning. Am I right on that?
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely, and then so that's why it's called a disorder. So technically, scientifically, from a classification perspective, that's the right term. I just don't like when I'm giving it to somebody as a diagnosis, suggesting to
that there's something wrong.
That somehow they're flawed.
Right. No, I love that distinction too.
Now, here's the really interesting thing about post-traumatic stress disorder is not everybody gets it. Everybody who's exposed to these traumatic events, they don't necessarily end up having the full-blown disorder. Everybody's affected by war. If you're in a war, you're probably going to have some post-traumatic stress symptoms, and everybody in the movie probably was. But what's really interesting is that while the trauma's occurring, this prolonged war trauma, a lot of those symptoms that we say you have PTSD once the conflict's done, they're actually adaptive and protective while the trauma's going on. So it's a really good thing to have an exaggerated startle response when you hear an explosion, when there's actually explosions going on around.
Right.
It's when the conflict's over and you can't turn that mechanism down or off that it becomes PTSD.
Yeah. Once a year, I just get a bee in my bonnet to watch Band of Brothers, which I just think is the greatest, mini series of all time, and it's cool to watch, the guys who were really part of the Airborne, and then in watching the show, it's like I can't even imagine what those guys went through, like day to day. One of those things would give me PTSD, and they went through thousands of them over and over again. And interesting to what you just said about like sometimes people don't get it. One guy talked about getting it much later in life. Like he was fine and he came home and he was fine. And then like 20 years later, he started, to get PTSD. What's going on there? Is that just simply like he wasn't even ready for it? His guard was finally let down. He was finally out of the wartime situation. Like how does that happen?
Yeah, so as you know, Jeff, and as our listeners probably don't know, I spent time in the U.S. Army as a psychiatrist, and in 2008, I
think this is the first time we've talked about
most of the year. Yeah, spent most of the year in Iraq, and one of the things that I came away from that is how rarely we actually diagnosed PTSD in the active war zone. A couple times, but primarily for folks who were on their multiple tours. But while you're there, it's kind of adaptive behavior.
Interesting. So it just becomes your norm.
It does. And then it's when you can't shut it off, or when you can't shut it off, or to say you can't shut it off implies too much control.
Sure.
It doesn't get shut off in the mechanism of your brain.
Yeah. I mean, look, knowing what, but I have no experience with this, but seeing and hearing what people have gone through who go through war, even talking to you about some of your experiences with it, I just think that one of the great blights on our society is that we don't just, anybody who's seen action comes home and just has, the best medical care, is just taken care of. Like, I just can't even imagine what it's like to go through any sort of wartime scenario. And then to come home and not be taken care of is absolute lunacy to me. But that's a topic for another time. Okay, so we're obviously going to talk more about PTSD. Let's move through the movie a little bit. Oh, so in that first scene, we've obviously talked about PTSD. She's got a little PTSD. I love the choice that the director makes to. Post the suicide bomber, we see Kirsten Dunst just walking among the dead, taking pictures. She's completely immune to this, and the young photographer takes a photograph of her taking pictures. And so, with my limited knowledge of this, I look at that as like disassociation, and to me, that's what this movie felt like. Maybe just because that's what I have some experience with. Like I remember disassociating after Dad died. But that scene is there for a reason. It's there to set up Kirsten Dunst's the way that she looks at the world versus the way that the young person sees the world, and sort of who the young person will grow to be if she gets on this path. But is that disassociation? Is that PTSD? Like, what's allowing her What's allowing her to do that?
Yeah, hard to tell, Jeff. I mean, could she be dissociating at that time? Maybe. They don't really tell us that. I think so. I can't really speak at it from a psychiatric perspective. Sure, looks like it just steals her resolve, and she does her job. Yeah, sure could be. I mean, she could be numbed to the whole thing, but also, people are who they are. She's clearly a war correspondent. I mean, I think
she's drawn to it in the first place.
Yeah, I think these people who run into that voluntarily are pretty amazing. Yeah, so I don't know, but that first scene was so powerful. As I was going through my notes today to get ready for our podcast, it struck me that I missed a whole bunch of symptoms that I usually pick up on because I was so drawn into this film.
Totally.
So immersed. And interestingly enough, that's actually not the first scene. The first scene is actually...
The first scene is Nick Offerman. Yeah, the president.
Nick Offerman's portrayal of the president, who
the
maybe is an
three-term
autocrat,
president.
maybe is... Yeah, I mean, yeah, but they do... They do such a great job of being ambiguous about how this whole thing turns out. I know that it's kind of getting... the people who don't like this movie, the reviewers who didn't like this movie, that's what they harp on. Is it's too ambiguous? Tell us how we got there.
No, I agree.
I completely disagree.
I agree with you, and I'm going to talk about that in just 1 minute here. So stay tuned. So we get to the next scene is the three of them. The third being the Stephen McKinley character, the older, wiser. He was once their mentor. They're talking about their goal, what they're going to do next, where they're going. And this is to me, and this is a screenwriting thing. This is a screenwriting note. This is fantastic world building. One, that scene is perfect exposition because they're legitimately talking about all the things we need to know. They're not forcing it. They're not saying like, well, if you remember this, and it's like, well, if they remember that, you wouldn't need to say it. That's terrible exposition. This is just simply like they're talking about what they need to be talking about in that scene. But, we as an audience are wondering, how did we get here? And it's incredibly complex, and we're going to learn about all of that as we go through the movie. We're going to get little tidbits here and there. But the writer had to do incredible world building, in prior to the making of this movie. And so the world building is complex, but the story is simple. And the story is simply, we need to get to Washington to interview the president. And that, to me, is fantastic storytelling. The more complex the world building, the simpler the story can be. And it's just very simply, we need to go see the president. It's the only story left. We want to go and interview the president and take a picture of the president. And I love that. I think that that's just, fantastic world building.
The line that sticks out to me from that exchange that built the whole world for me, that told me almost the only line I needed was when Wagner Morrow's character says to Sammy, he says, well, then you can file for whatever's left of the New York Times. Right. That was remarkable. Yeah. I mean, this institution is just, that was great.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's
I don't need to know anything else.
Yeah. Because in their world, that is true. And then we can sort of fill in the gaps the blanks as to how we got there. And the writer doesn't need to make a political point. Because he's not making a point about the right is good or the left is good. He's making a point about the senselessness of us, of us fighting each other. So, for the people who missed the point, or to the people who wanted something different, make your own fucking movie. Anyway, I should not have said that. I'm not editing that out because I believe it. Okay. Anyway, so we get the first like tense scene of the movie, post the suicide bombing, where they need gas. So they're on this road trip. They're trying to go see the president. They're trying to get to D.C. And so they need gas. And so they stop at a gas station, and the people who are running the gas station have two guys hanging from the rafters. And the young journalist doesn't know what to do, can't take out their camera. And Kirsten Dunst comes over and takes a picture with the captives. And she kind of diffuses the situation by saying, "Hey, can I take your picture with these men you've got strung up?" And the guy's like, "Sure, that sounds awesome." And so they take the picture, and they're able to kind of get away. Super powerful scene. A really good example of negotiation. A really good example of her knowing what somebody wants, which is to feel heard, to feel seen, to feel like what they're doing is important. And you can do that with a camera. But I thought that was really interesting and a great way to juxtapose, the grizzled veteran versus, the young character. I don't know if there's any comments you want to make about that scene. I just loved it.
Yeah, so for me, Jeff, what that scene started to do was it started to really open the can of sociopaths being able to flourish in wartime. Civility is broken down. Even the folks who aren't on the front lines, either in one army or the other army, are starting to just not care or really lean into being cruel. I mean, the young man even said, I went to high school with this guy. I mean, they knew each other.
Yeah.
But it didn't matter. He had them strung up in one of the grossest, most horrendous ways possible.
Yeah, and so much of this movie is so brutal because I believe most of it. Like, I don't think that it's all that fantastical to think that there are going to be these people who, who come out of the woodwork and this is how they would sort of react. We're going to talk about the sniper scene in a bit, but like that scene to me was super powerful. But we'll get to that soon.
Yeah, the whole movie just scratches at the thin veneer of civilization. I've heard, I can't remember who said it or who it's attributed to, but every civilization is 3 meals away from a revolution. Oh,
interesting. Yeah, that's well said. I can't remember who I was talking to, but it was somebody in I think FEMA or some level of government where they said that if Los Angeles was without power for 9 days, it would be unrecoverable because we would descend into chaos and madness that quickly. Where it's not like it would just, okay, now we've put the power back on. It would be straight up unrecoverable. That's how much damage we would do. Which I thought was fascinating. Anyway, okay, so
Jeff is of course on the tourism board for Los Angeles County. LA County, 9 days away from being unrecoverable.
9 days away from utter destruction. Anyway, on our left, we've got. Okay, so then this was a weird moment in the film where they take a little detour. So they see this gunfire at night, and Wagner Moore's character is like, "Hey, let's go check it out. Like there's something going on there. Like let's go do it." And so they go, and they're with not the military uniformed side. And this is one of the interesting things I thought about this movie is that they swap between who they're following. So they follow the military dress, they follow the civilian dress. So they really are once again just not taking sides. So they take this detour. Kaylee, the young journalist, starts to get into it a little bit more. She starts taking some dangerous shots. She's feeling the rush. And at the very end of that scene, Wagner Moore's character he's like, "Oh, what a rush!" And he's clearly in this for the adrenaline. So talk to me a little bit about the psychology of adrenaline junkies. I consider myself in that, a little bit in that category where I've taken some really stupid risks. I fell off a bridge one time because I didn't measure a climbing rope. And so I get this a little bit, but what is going on there? Is that something that can be learned? Can people become addicted to adrenaline? Like, what's the deal with us junkies?
Yeah, I mean, some people are just risk takers. They get the thrill. Some people are wired that way. Some people aren't. That's not pathologic. It's just a personality type.
In this case, is it a defense mechanism?
Maybe. Yeah, maybe. I mean, all these folks probably have PTSD. Wagner probably has PTSD. Or his character probably has PTSD.
Yeah.
Maybe. I mean, it's kind of what draws you to this stuff too. It's so tough. As we've talked about this entire podcast, all these disorders are exaggerations of adaptive behaviors that we do. He probably got into it and is probably a good journalist because he's willing to put himself, and she's willing to put herself into dangerous situations to get the job done.
Okay, so the next stop in the movie, they stop at a city that is just not paying attention to the fact that there's a civil war.
You guys are aware there's like a pretty huge civil war going on all across America.
Oh, sure, but we just try to stay out.
Stay out.
With what we see on the news, seems like it's for the best.
Yeah.
And it's so funny. This almost felt like an Odysseus tale, where there was something that they met at every stop and a different thing that Alex Garland wanted to say, about us. And so this was the stop on their journey where, nothing had changed and people were putting their head in the sand. And this is such an important point to make about the human condition and what we do in times of trauma and struggle. Not to bring things back to, the ultimate evil of like the Holocaust, but this is what happened with a lot of Germans, where they're just like, I'm not going to pay attention to what's going on next door. And I think about this even in our society today, where it's like, oh, our society's the absolute best. Whoa, sorry, let me just step over this homeless guy. Our society's the absolute best, and we just don't look at these things. And there are things that I think are happening that we just don't look at. And we see these people in this store as ridiculous for not understanding there's a civil war going on around them. But we're doing very similar things right now in society. So that scene really, really kind of stuck with me, and I thought was an important point that Alex Garland made.
Yeah, completely agree. I think back to World War II as well, and the stories that you hear about the occupied French, and they're just trying to go about their business, their day, because they can't really resist, they can't really stop it. So let's just try to do what we can do.
Yeah,
I think it's natural.
Yeah, Wagner Moura in an interview.
In these situations, we tend to think that people succumb to the horror of what's going on, and that happens too. But people live their lives, in war zones. People go to bars. When I was in Bogota, it was the most doing narcos. People were going out during the bombs and everything back in the 80s.
But it just reminds me of the frog in the boiling pot metaphor. You drop a frog in a boiling pot, it jumps out. But if you slowly bring the water up to a boil, then they don't move and they boil to death. And it's like that is how I think we get into a lot of these eventual sort of pressure points. Is we just don't pay attention to the temperature rising. All right. So
by the way, by the way, that's a terrible anecdote. It's a complete myth. The frog jumps out of the slowly boiling pot too.
You're such a dick.
That's great. You want to talk about the Greek for the forum again? You want to go back to that? Josh Jones, man who cares about accuracy.
Why don't we move on to the next scene, Jeff?
Okay, so this was a great scene. So the next scene, they come upon a sniper. So again, they're just on their way to DC. They're in the car, and they come upon a sniper, and they get attacked by a sniper, and they fall in with some men now in uniform, who are trying to kill the sniper. And the question is asked by one of the journalists, "Who are you fighting for?" And they're like, I don't know. It's like, you don't even know who you're fighting for? And the sniper has such a great response.
No one's giving us orders, man.
Someone's trying to kill us. We are trying to kill them.
And man, I just buy that. That just made total sense to me. When you can take a 30,000-foot view of a situation, you can see how ridiculous violence is and how ridiculous tribalism is. But when you're in it, it's addictive. You know, I mean, you see it with just like, Cubs fans versus White Sox fans. It doesn't make any sense that these people would get in a fight, but they just decide, we don't like you, you don't like me. It starts to get a little heated. Next thing you know, two completely reasonable people are fighting each other. And this is that to the nth degree. And I just thought that was a really powerful scene.
Yeah, it speaks to the fringes in war. Again, going back to this, whether you're on the front lines fighting on one army versus the other army, that's probably where a minority of the actual conflict and death occurs. It's in these outer areas that aren't captured in the history books, for the Battle of the Bulge and D-Day and things like that. There's probably more death and destruction and chaos sown around the edges like this than there is on the front lines. For instance, in this movie at Charlottesville and D.C.
Yeah.
Isn't that crazy?
Like, is it just that people want to kill, or is it just that people get caught up? Like, what is it?
Yeah, you get caught up, you get scared, you get opportunistic. How many times have we kind of felt like just in our 40 plus years of life, I wonder if the world's ending. If you're really in a war, the world is ending. Your world is ending.
Yeah. Again, going back to Band of Brothers, it's a great line that Lieutenant Spears had.
You hid in that ditch because you think there's still hope. But Blythe, the only hope you have is to accept the fact that you're already dead.
And you have to just understand that, accept that if you're going to be a good soldier. And I just remember that being like, I don't ever want to go to war. I don't ever want to go to war. It just sounds awful. Good stuff. Okay, so then we get to my favorite scene in the movie, which is the car swap scene. And again, this is sort of a storytelling thing, but this scene is just a masterclass in tension. So Kirsten Dunst is driving the truck, and a car comes up behind them, and the car's tires squeal, and so they're like, oh God, these guys are here for no good. They've been following us. And so we think something bad's going to happen, and then they pull up, and it's their friends.
What the Tony?
And so we take our foot off the gas in terms of tension. And then one of them decides he wants to like swap over to the car. And so there's another build in tension. He does it just fine. Then the little girl wants to, the young photojournalist wants to cross. More tension. She crosses over. It's fine. So it's this constant build up and release in tension. And then the car drives off, and it drives over a little hill, and then our hero car drives over that hill, and that car is gone.
Where did they go?
And once again, we're back to this really tense place. It's such a great masterclass in tension and release. And then I'm just going to let you talk about this next part, because they drive on, they find the car abandoned, and Jesse Plemons enters the chat.
Then they get to the scene that everybody's talking about, and they should be talking about it, because it's just a pretty damn remarkable scene. And then Jesse Plemons is playing this militiaman. We don't know what side he's on. It's kind of not important. And they're clearly doing a massive war crime. They're burying a bunch of civilian bodies that they just massacred. And the team comes up to them, and then he displays, I think, the movie's only real explicit racism and nationalism, where he asks, what kind of American are you?
Right.
Okay. What kind of American are you? You don't know?
And the foreign guy who says he's from Hong Kong, he kills him immediately. And this is really where I think it hits home for me, that war is the sociopath's refuge.
Right.
You can get away with literal murder, and it's okay. And our societal line for what's permitted and what isn't, it really erodes during times of conflict and times of war. And the sociopath takes advantage of this. I mean, he is a clear sociopath, and it was great. I mean, it's an absolutely fabulous scene. Jeff, from a filmmaking perspective, I would like to know who made the decision and how the decision was made to put those eerie red sunglasses on him, because that was freaking phenomenal. Because they were discordant. They clearly weren't military. They were like something that my daughter would pick up at a beach shop, and they made the entire scene so eerie to me. And I want to know who made that decision, how to get made. Was it just like, here, put this on? Because it's creepy as hell.
Yeah, it's when you play against type, or you play against expectations, that's when things get really creepy. So you'll see a really so a great example is like the ear cutting scene from Reservoir Dogs, where Madsen's character just decides he's going to torture the cop, and then he puts on Stuck in the Middle with You, that song, and it's like, it's creepier because it's so blasé, it's so commonplace.
Yeah. Okay.
And so it's that juxtaposition is so nice in terms of building someone's brutality. We wouldn't have noticed if he was just wearing sunglasses. If he was just wearing tactical Oakleys, we wouldn't have noticed. And also, a real soldier would have been wearing tactical Oakleys, and this was not a real soldier. This was a sociopath. This was somebody doing really bad things. So it helped to differentiate him from sort of the norm. And that was absolutely an Alex Garland decision. It's very much in his style, and it worked beautifully because he understands, that you need to juxtapose those things, and it's not all about having, gruesome visuals. It's about lightening it up to make it even worse.
It did.
Yeah, that's really good filmmaking. Okay, so so this is again one of those things where like it just kind of bugs me in movies where it's the convenient character deaths. So it's like, all right, we need someone to die who we care about. So let's introduce these two Asian dudes, and have our two main characters be like, oh my God, we love you so much, you guys are the best, just so that we can feel terrible when they die. And then in that scene as well, the Stephen McKinley character gets injured in a way that makes absolutely no sense. The only time the only time they're taking gunfire is when they're driving away, and somehow the driver gets hit in the chest. That was just so that they could take away the mentor. And so to me, those are really convenient character deaths. And I want the Samuel L. Jackson, whatever that movie, what Deep something, where he gets bit by the shark halfway through the movie.
We're gonna seal off this.
Deep.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. What was the movie?
Yeah. Was it Deep Blue Sea?
Deep Blue Sea, yeah, and just all of a sudden he gets bit by a shark, and it's like, oh, it's just jarring. Like when it's too easy to predict like when people are going to die, it just kind of takes me out a little bit. But this film was This was a masterpiece, so no shade. But there was a moment where
that was the one predictable or weak part. I was like, and it would, okay.
Yeah, we'll get to the other.
He needed to die. We knew he was going to die.
Right. And we'll get to the other one later. But and this to me is the scene that really triggers Kirsten Dunst's PTSD. There are other scenes. They go to this base. They learn that the president is just about to be taken. So they're too late. Their mentors just died. So they're at their low point. This is the low point of the movie. And we haven't seen Kirsten Dunst break yet, but we're about to. And so they follow the army into the Capitol, and she starts to display, I think, you tell me, signs of PTSD. We talk about portrayal on this show. So did Kirsten Dunst? Real quick aside, by the way, I have met Kirsten Dunst a few times because she lives in my neighborhood, and her and I go to the same coffee shop. she is delightful. She is really lovely. We've just talked about our kids a couple times because we both like had our kids. She's really, really wonderful. But my nickname, because I have like a pretend friendship with her now, and my pretend friendship name for her is Humpty Dunsty. So a few times during this podcast, I've wanted to call her Humpty Dunsty, and so I almost said, "Tell me about Humpty Dunsty's performance there, and whether it was a good portrayal of PTSD." I'm sorry, Kirsten, if you happen to watch this. There's no way you're going to, but yeah, Humpty Dunsty is my friendship name for Kirsten.
Anyway, everybody's heard about the fight or flight response, and you've heard me correct you a couple times already in this podcast and call it the fight, flight, or freeze response. And that is exactly what happened to Lee in this scene. Once they get into the siege of DC,
I'm freezing.
Sorry, folks. Jeff is not going to move until I say unfreeze, so I will say unfreeze. So they're following the Western forces into Washington D.C. and Kirsten really loses it, or Lee really loses it, and she's frozen, and she's only saved by Joel's character grabbing her and pulling her along.
Right.
Interestingly enough, I really liked that portrayal, Jeff, because the way it played out, the way it didn't really faze Joel, it kind of suggested this had happened before.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point.
And from time to time,
Yeah.
which I think is totally plausible. I mean, you can suppress this stuff, you can press this stuff only so often, and then once in a while, your brain's just going to say, "You got to deal with this right now."
Yeah.
And it was right then, and I'm going to give a major spoiler. It was right then in that moment when I'm like, okay, Lee's the one who's going to die.
Yeah, that's because you're not a
losing it.
screenwriter.
She's gonna,
but
she's
yeah.
gonna make a mistake.
Yeah.
She's the one who's gonna make a mistake.
Yeah.
I'm not a screenwriter. Oh, well, I predicted that one.
No, I know, but the I knew she was going to die when the young photojournalist says, "If I died, would you take a picture of me?" And so I was like, okay, well, obviously Kirsten Dunst is going to die, and she's going to take a picture of her, and that's then that's exactly what happens. She died, and she's taking a picture as she's falling on her, which we're getting a little ahead of ourselves. That's the next scene. They
that happened. That happens.
Well, yeah,
next.
but I think it's a good moment where Lee is ahead of the military. She's smarter than everybody else, saying like, that's not the president. The president's still in the White House, and they go in. There's a shootout, and what happens next is the worst part of the movie. She saves Kaylee's life, but she does it in the stupidest way. Folks, if there's a kid in the middle of the road and someone's going to run out and save the kid, you've seen these videos where they pick up the kid and their momentum continues. That's what people do. And so Kirsten Dunst runs into Lee, she runs into the photojournalist, shoves her on the ground, and then continues to stand there. That's just not what she would have done. She would have tackled her off to the side. It made absolutely no sense, but it's one of those things that you just kind of expect, in movies where somehow they work like a pool ball that like hits and then stays. That part bugged me, and obviously she had to get shot, and she had to get shot saving the young photojournalist. But that scene just didn't work for me. But whatever, it was a masterpiece of a movie. That's one moment where I can criticize. I'm just going to keep talking so Josh can't interject.
Her momentum was clearly slowed. It was clearly slowed and stopped by destiny.
Okay, I'm glad you said something dumb, because for a second there I thought you believed that. Okay, so they make it into the Oval Office, and Maura Wagner before they kill the president, he gets his quote. Josh, I didn't hear it. What was the quote?
It was, "Please don't let them shoot, or let them kill me, or let them shoot me."
And then he says, like, everybody wants to?
No, then he says, "That'll do," or he says, "Good enough," something like that.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead and shoot him. Yeah.
Yeah,
It was.
I didn't hear it.
It was it was pretty anticlimactic. I think that was absolutely the point. It wasn't
I think it was
profound.
the point too. I just couldn't hear it.
Oh yeah. Well, you're getting old.
Yeah, it was one of those. It was one of those Tenet moments where like I couldn't hear it, and I was like, "Come on, do better sound design."
Yeah. No.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's the movie.
That's the movie. Give me some final thoughts just about PTSD. One of the things we didn't talk about is what people can do if they think they're experiencing PTSD. What are some of the resources? How can we make this helpful?
Yeah. First of all, if you've experienced a traumatic event, everybody's response to trauma is different, and the number one thing I recommend you do, and this is not as a doctor, this is just as a person, is do your damnedest to not blame yourself. Do your damnedest to not feel guilty and feel like you've done something wrong, and then go get help. Talk to anyone who you know is a safe person to talk to, whether that's doctor, parent, pastor, doesn't matter. Start to figure out with a trusted person, a trusted adult, where you can get some help and how you can start to recover from it. Now, again, not everybody who experiences trauma experiences post-traumatic stress disorder. Sometimes people who have had PTSD throughout a long period of their life, it comes and goes. Therapy is very effective. Some antidepressant medications can be very effective, but learning about it, educating yourself about why is my brain, why is my body doing this, is very, very helpful.
Yeah, and if you've experienced some great trauma, please let us know in the comments below.
Jeff, before we move off the movie, I think it is important. I mean, I think we should talk a little bit about some of the criticism of the movie, especially in this kind of fraught time we have in 2024, because I think everybody wanted to look at this movie about an allegory of right versus left, red versus blue, of what's going on in our country right now. And I thought, and I want to give credit to the filmmakers, I know that this was a choice. I don't know who was who. And everybody said, "Oh, it's completely unrealistic that Texas and California would team up." I don't know.
Also, if you're paying close attention, they didn't team up. They had their own forces. So California, Texas, and Florida were different contingents, all fighting against the U.S. So I didn't take that.
California and Texas were in league, and then Florida had
Florida was on its own
thingy. Yeah,
because nobody can get along with Florida. Nobody would have believed that.
There's one map that they show in the movie, and it's also got like the northwestern states have peeled off into some other kind of faction. So they didn't dwell on it. I think that was the point. I think it was a really good choice. It doesn't matter. I don't think it matters how you get there. It's that we can get there.
Right.
And I think people need to be that's what people need to take from this, is if we don't figure out how to come together, we will fall apart.
Yeah. Not to be too much of a downer there, but like, I mean, every day I have less and less hope that that's going to happen. But until it does, let's keep pumping out some podcasts. Let's keep talking about it. I'm kind of joking, but it's also, one of the only things we can do. Like you and I started this podcast to be helpful. We did not start this to get famous or anything. We would just want to talk to people about mental health. It's something we both have struggled with, and we want to, help make people's lives better who have experienced the same thing that we do. And I think that that's all you can do is talk and keep the conversation going, as they say. Okay, final portrayal grade from Josh. How did they do? I know you loved the movie, but is your portrayal grade similar to your love of the film?
Yeah, it really was. I mean, they did a nuanced job of portraying Lee at different points of PTSD. It wasn't a unitary or monolithic thing for her, as it's not for most people. I think they did a really nice job. And it's another example of how you can portray mental illness correctly and still have it serve as either a part or a side plot to your film.
Yeah. Yeah, I completely agree. And I was really glad I was there, honestly. Like, going into it, I didn't see any of that in the trailers. So, you know, once it was very clear that this was going to be about PTSD, it's going to be about dissociation, you know, I was pretty happy. I mean, as a moviegoer going in, I was like, okay, I'm in good hands. And I feel that way about, you know, Alex Garland movies. So I'm glad that he crushed it. Okay, so this was sort of a drop-in episode of Cinemental. So we had promised viewers after the last one that they were going to get Fight Club. So that is going to be next week's movie. Is going to be Fight Club. So yeah, look forward to that. Thanks as always for watching or listening to Cinemental and our coverage of Civil War. If you like this video, please like and subscribe on YouTube, or you can find us anywhere you get your podcasts. We're also on Patreon for Josh Jones. I am Jeff Jones, and we will see you next week for Fight Club.